Someone's clapping and I haven't even said anything yet. How about that? So I just came back from Washington, D.C., and 2 blocks from the White House is the African American History Museum. And on the wall, it says, in the 1400s, African and European people traded for centuries across the Mediterranean, exchanging diverse goods, cultures, and knowledge. An Atlantic world was forming that connected people and ports along the Atlantic Ocean's rim. But by the 1600s, an unanticipated shift happened. People became commodity. So America's promise of freedom is filled with contradiction. Few people understood this more clearly than enslaved and free African Americans. As the lifeblood of the new republic, slavery expanded with brutal intensity after the Revolution. The national economy relied upon slavery. The U.S. Constitution defended it. By the end of the period, race-based slavery was the law of economy. Africans were enslaved for life. So there's a day. There's a day we have now. People plan for it. They attend and experience festivities associated with the day, Juneteenth. We just had it. You know, it's that day when General Granger issued the proclamation to some people who were gathered in Galveston, Texas, these people who had a birthright to freedom and lost that birthright and were then told 2.5 years later that, well, they were supposed to have been freed, and, oh yeah, they were freed after all, but they weren't free. It was that day. And I submit that freedom doesn't happen in a day. Freedom work is a journey, and we all walk it, either forwards or backwards. There's a quote I love. It says, "The only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion." How do we become so absolutely free? Well, there's that word, Ubuntu, the connotation of oneness and connection. I am because you are. I am because we are. So striving for absolute freedom means the work of freedom for all. Was finding out the secret of freedom, hidden away for 2.5 years and shared in Texas, the epitome of absolute freedom? I don't think so. It's like finding out that land that your parents owned was deeded to you, but that due to eminent domain, it became a freeway. It's yours, but it's not. It's yours, but now it's not. But it kind of is. And to me, that's the journey of Juneteenth. This idea of this journey toward freedom actually began with human trafficking, which occurred not in 1619, as people think, but as far back as the 1500s. And from the day of the first capture, no doubt Africans yearned for a return to freedom, to their plush land, their interconnected society, their strong spiritual practices, their health equity, their right to be what makes us whole, the God in us and all that we call holy. And it's Negro spirituals and songs that speak of both that yearning and that quest to be free. You're going to hear the song, "I wish I knew how it would feel to be free. I wish I could break all those chains holding me." At that time, the desire for freedom was so strong that people risked their lives to leave oppressive and unjust domination, and time and again were caught by those who lived to oppress them. It reminds me of another group of people, even now, who are seeking to escape oppression, who came here only to find oppression in this land of the free. Are we free? It was after the Juneteenth proclamation that this scenario occurred on the journey toward freedom. The setting was Gwynn Oaks Park. It was a whites-only park in Maryland, and for a decade, the journey of protest occurred outside the park as Black parents desired to take their children but were disallowed from entering. And from 1955 on, Baltimore clergy, along with local chapters of CORE, a civil rights group, and the NAACP, they marched, they demonstrated for integration at Gwynn Oaks Park. And during that period of peaceful demonstrations, there were 283 people arrested, including church clergy who were charged with trespassing outside of the park. The only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion. And so on August 28th, 1963, which just happens to be the exact same date as the March on Washington, an 8-year journey of demonstrations, sit-ins, or sit-ons, I guess you could say, and protests, African American families won the right to integrate Gwynn Oaks Park. And 11-month-old Sharon Langley did more than just point to the park. She got her father to take her in. She was the first African American to ride a carousel in that park in Maryland. Please remember that this was after Juneteenth, when you have to fight for every little thing, that's not freedom. In one part of the nation, people were fighting for voting rights. In another part, they were fighting to take their baby inside of a park. That's ridiculous. And 3 years prior to that, did you see that bus in the back that looks like this? Elementary students created that segregated bus. 3 years prior to that, African Americans couldn't integrate buses. And the journey began. People walked and walked. And on December 5th, 1955, 90% of Montgomery's black citizens voted to and stayed off of buses. Officials obtained injunctions against the boycott in February 1956 and indicted over 80 boycott leaders under a law that prohibited conspiracies that interfered with lawful business. Martin Luther King Jr. was tried and convicted on that charge, but despite that resistance, the boycott continued. And day after day, African Americans in Montgomery refused to ride buses, relying on carpools, walking, and other alternative means of other African Americans who had cars and would drive people. The bus company didn't consider the financial loss because the majority of the people riding the buses were black. They lost $3,000 per day, which was a whole lot of money back there. And on December 20th, 1956, after a journey of 381 days of walking, the Montgomery buses were ordered to desegregate. Transportation boycotts started in the 1800s, actually, and in many states and in many countries after Juneteenth. I don't think we were free. In South Africa, the issue wasn't the placement on the bus. In South Africa, they had whites-only buses. There's a news article that stated that there's a woman named Pasha Ramakova who was the first to step forward daily with a ticket to board the whites-only bus. The driver closed the door in her face, and people began to do that day after day after day. That was in 1989. Apartheid ended 5 years later. After the journey that led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, granting African Americans the right to vote, it was met with resistance by a governor, you might know his name, and only 2% of Selma's eligible population was allowed to vote. And so on March In March 1965, 600 people attempted to walk from Selma to Montgomery. I mentioned to you before that I did that walk, in an effort to register black voters. They were prevented by troops. 2 days later, they journeyed again, but this time the numbers grew to 2,000. Third try. On March 15th, 2,000 protesters walked the 54-mile journey, but this time they were met in Montgomery by 50,000 supporters, black and white, where they gathered in front of the Capitol. The only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion. I'm going to go back to that. In August, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which guaranteed the right to vote for all African Americans. But this is still a journey being traveled by many whose very existence along this journey is an act of rebellion in favor of freedom. So Juneteenth has a journey, and understanding that journey helps us to commemorate it, not celebrate it, but commemorate it as more than just a day. Understanding that journey also shifts the lens of what happened back there from thinking that there was this one person who freed enslaved black Americans to what they did for themselves. I submit that Lincoln did not free the slaves. Enslaved people freed themselves. They were supported by allies who walked the journey of freedom with them. And we are called to be allies now, because freedom is still on a journey. The journey began when freedom was first lost in the late 1500s, and the largest mass of human trafficking occurred from Africa. The journey began with the first outcry against the attempt to remove the beingness of a people, the physical, the emotional, the mental, and the spiritualness that made them the people of God within that they were. Juneteenth recognizes the day when Granger arrived in Galveston on June 19th with an announcement that enslaved people were freed, as indicated in the executive order, 2.5 years before. But Lincoln's intention was actually never to free the slaves. He said, I quote, "I have no intention of interfering with slavery in states where it exists." So that was never actually what he was going to do. The proclamation issued by Lincoln said that he was going to free the slaves in territories that rebelled against the Union, states where he had no jurisdiction. He was over the Union, he wasn't over the Confederacy. But he said he was going to free the slaves who were a part of the Confederacy, but he had no jurisdiction over them. It was a nice talk, nice thing, but they hadn't won the war yet. But there were enslaved people in the North where he had authority, and the Emancipation Proclamation didn't name them. So they were not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation either. It did neither. And so on that day, actually, they weren't included, and the other ones weren't included because he didn't have jurisdiction over them. So the war ended, the North won. Lincoln then almost had the authority to then free the slaves, because then he was over everybody, except he died within a week after that. And it takes ratification in order for a proclamation to have had any teeth, and it wasn't ratified. It had to go through the House and the Senate, and that didn't happen until December. So Juneteenth meant really nothing on that day or at that time. It also, for whatever reason, didn't free indigenous people. The Chickasaw and the Choctaw nations were still enslaved until 1866. But there's this announcement. So who was there to hear it? Well, where were most of the enslaved people? They were out being slaves. They were working the plantations. I even sent that question to AI. I said, I was just curious. Did slave owners let their slaves go listen to the Emancipation Proclamation? And it said, yes. So then I said, did the slaves get to hear the Emancipation Proclamation? And it said, no. It said in the majority of cases, no. Slave owners did not excuse their slaves to go hear the Emancipation Proclamation. So you have this proclamation, and everybody says Granger was there and he was announcing it, but who was he announcing it to? Definitely not to the people that he was saying they were going to be freed. They were still working. And their owners didn't want them to hear that information, nor were they going to pull them from the fields to go listen to it. See where I'm going with that? And so, why is it that they didn't? Well, some of them resisted emancipation for their slaves, and so they didn't want them to know. Some of them wanted to continue to exploit them for as long as they possibly could. So, in reality, General Granger gave the announcement to about 1,200 slaves and free people and slave owners, but there were 250,000 slaves just in that city. So, how did the slaves actually learn about the Emancipation Proclamation? Some of them learned from Union soldiers. Some of them learned from word of mouth. Some of them learned from abolitionist networks. Some of them learned from people called freedom seekers who had been helping enslaved people to escape enslavement. And what did the journey look like after that announcement? Well, the picture is painted of freed African Americans who joyously ran, running to freedom, while their white slave owners were cheering them on or sadly watching them go, giving them cake. And while we can imagine this happy Juneteenth announcement, what it has done is to have comfortably erased the reality that racism was still alive and well. But the record speaks for itself. One enslaved person named John Sanford said, "A free Negro of the African race whose ancestors were brought to this country and sold as slaves is not a citizen." He was an enslaver. They had no rights, which the white man was bound to respect. And that goes in line with what Frederick Douglass says. He says, "You say you emancipated us, but what is your emancipation? When you turned us loose, you gave us no acres. You turned us loose to the sky. You turned us loose to the storm, to the whirlwind, and worst of all, you turned us loose to the wrath of our infuriated masters." And many forget the portions of the Emancipation Proclamation that kept freed people under another relative form of bondage. It said, you can enter into an employer-employee relationship, but with whom? Who was going to pay you? Who didn't have to pay you before? It didn't require the slave owners to pay. It just said to the enslaved people, you can get a job that will pay you. It said, you can take all of your belongings. Well, what'd you have? It said, you can take all your money. All of none? And even without any of those things, many freed people tried to leave before they got caught by their former slave owners and were returned to their plantation beaten. Historians say that Juneteenth was actually a period of chaos. Even outside of their own plantation, as one freed slave put it, "For we colored people did not know how to be free, and the white people did not know how to have a free colored person around them." And the Emancipation Proclamation said, you cannot loiter or you'll be jailed. But think about it. You've been enslaved all your life, your family separated, and no understanding of your geography outside of the plantation where you were forced to remain. You had no access to read or write under threat of death. That you had to put yourself in a position where you didn't loiter, or you knew that you would end up being incarcerated or placed back on a plantation. The only enslaved people who had some semblance of understanding about what they might do were the few people, let's see if I can get back to that. Oops. The few people who, I know, this is forward. Okay. Deanne, I'm going to let you play with this. The Army. There we go. The only people who might have known what they could do were the soldiers, the black soldiers that had fled as runaway slaves to the north and then were accepted as contraband and started to work. They could stay in the Army. They knew that that was the possibility. The other people hid in small groups or communities to keep from getting caught and sent back as slaves, while they tried to sort out what to do, how to eat, where their family members were, where were the safe places to go, and how to get there. That's what happened on Juneteenth. That's the truth of Juneteenth. And one might wonder, how did these people go through all of that? How did they manage through this journey? How did they deal with it, knowing that they may not end up being recipients of the very freedom that they sought? That's not ours to question. It's ours to witness. It's ours to model. It's ours to commemorate this work, this courage, this journey. The history of Juneteenth could never just be captured within a day. It's a story of fulfillment. It's the arc that is long but bends toward justice. Among other things, I think the story of Juneteenth tells us about the historical journey of freedom and those who walked it. Imagine what courage it took to be kidnapped and taken to another land, one's homes and belongings taken away, one's language removed, one's family separated. What courage it took, hoping that freedom would come, if not to you, then maybe to your offspring, only then to survive generation after generation after generation, and it didn't come. And you still kept having the same wish for freedom, for somebody. What courage it took, being the one who tried to escape, help others to escape, observing others escape, praying, hoping that they'd make it to freedom, but then seeing them get caught and returned to a worse enslaved state. What courage it took for white and black people who aided others to freedom, risking their lives so that others could experience some semblance of freedom. What courage it took for us now to witness these journeys of freedom, putting ourselves in the shoes of another, to understand on some minute level what they went through anew and again and again and again. And what courage it takes for us to discover our work, our part of this journey toward freedom for all, because we're still in it. And so I submit this is also your journey. This is also your part in the legacy of Juneteenth. And you're invited, you're called to step into that journey, a journey which may look different from someone else, but it's our journey to travel, our courage to hold. As it's said, not everyone will understand your journey, and that's fine. It's not their journey to make sense of, it's yours. And so don't get tired. There's no time for that. Don't get weary. There's no time for that. Think about these people who didn't have the time, who had to just keep going, who couldn't figure out what to do or where to go, but had to go somewhere and do something. Not everyone will understand your journey. That's fine. It's not their journey to make sense of, but make sense of your journey. As we continue our Juneteenth journey of freedom work, we have to recognize that the only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free, to speak out with such absolute freedom, to stand with, to stand by, to stand for others with such absolute freedom that our very existence is an act of rebellion. So I want you to take this affirmation, I'm going to say it in parts, and consider that also your meditation. And if you'll repeat each part after me. Our journey is not finished.
Our journey is not finished.
But we have come a long way. I will not follow where the path may lead.
I will not follow where the path may lead.
But I will go where there is no path. And I will leave a trail. Amen.